You know those times where you're just getting over having a cold or being sick with the flu or whatnot? You feel you're feeling better, but you're exhausted still all the same? That's where I'm at right now. Welcome, folks. This is Joe from Joe Thinks, and today I am going to be attempting a Selector challenge. Another YouTuber that I watch their stuff frequently because they showcase other artists and different ideas is Proko. Around Halloween, they had Scott Flanders from Riot Games. He did a bunch of Swamp Thing art using the Selector Tool and showing how cool that could be used as the primary art tool that you use for a piece of art. I did some looking afterwards, and turns out this is a thing, the Selector Tool Challenge. Now, I've pretty much got right back into my own routine right off the bat and stopped using the Selector Tool at the beginning for a little bit of fine detail. And I failed right off at the bat after I did some of the buildings there. But let's keep going all the same. Maybe we'll modify the rules to say fine detail and shading. Still doesn't count. The setting I chose is like a nuclear post-apocalyptic, like from the Fallout series. If you're not familiar with Fallout, it is a post-apocalyptic game series that was originally released by Black Isle Studios and Interplay, and then later purchased by Bethesda, the same folks that make Skyrim. So the story for Fallout is an alternate reality to our own. That after World War II, in their world, the transistor never got invented. So modern electrical switches and circuit boards and stuff like we know never really got invented. They continue to rely on vacuum tubes and like ancient technology, and that actually did allow them to push forward. And it's why it's kind of considered like an atom punk. It's not steampunk, because there's like atom fusion reactors and things like that everywhere, but it's still like this whole 1950s attitude and entire culture that existed in this game before obviously the end of the world, because it's post-apocalyptic. But the entire mentality of what's going on is like a Red Scare situation like we had in the 1950s, only this lasts well into the 21st century and right up into what causes the great calamity that destroys the entire world. Now, it begins back in their timeline around 2052 when gasoline ran out. Petroleum was no longer a thing anymore. Shortly afterwards, the United Nations was disbanded, and the United States annexed Canada and consumed their resources. China, which is the major communist entity in this, still, we're in the 1950s mentality here in the United States, where these folks are running out of resources. Cars and stuff are now coming with like fusion reactors. The atomic age is here. It just took much, much longer for that to happen. However, China then invades Alaska and gets mainland. They make it all the way to California with some of their operatives. And the terrible thing about what happens is some of the Chinese operatives, while they invade Alaska, these like best of the best Chinese get down into some government research facilities that are in the southwest area of the United States. And they release this biological weapon that was being developed by the United States, and it causes this whole new plague. Now, at this point, the Americans fight back, and they push China back out with some awesome technology, such as portable nuclear weapons and they're basically walking around in armored tanks, only the tank is literally like armor on them. That's called power armor. And it allows them to be able to fight back individually and carry massive weapons, including be able to protect themselves against their portable nuclear weapons that they're using now. Now, after that war took place, the United States got in bed with a tech giant that was called Vault-Tec that makes underground bunkers. Basically, at this point, everyone knew there was a huge Cold War, and the moment anybody launched anything would be the end of the world. Now, it took about 20 years, but on October 23rd, 2077, tension between the US and China escalated to nuclear war. It took only 2 hours to destroy the entire world. The results of that calamity are where all of the stories for the Fallout games take place in. It's the world after. Now, the US government survives too, but it becomes a faction called the Enclave, which are absolutionists that believe that any human being that's been touched by radiation is not a human being anymore. Now, to make matters worse, after the explosions, after the bombs went off, there are now mutants, these great big giant super mutants that are the result of a forced evolutionary virus that is part of that biological weapon that got released. The FEV is what they call the forced evolutionary virus. It actually creates all kinds of different terrible mutants. And then, of course, in the Fallout world, the whole concept that radiation would mutate us into different forms that were stable, or maybe not stable, I guess. Think back to the 80s with like Toxic Avenger and stuff like that, but would mutate us and give us powers and stuff. What if that happened? And that is also a reality within the Fallout world, that all kinds of crazy things have come from a result of either the FEV virus being in the air or just radiation in specific areas altogether. Now, the VaultTec relationship with the United States government, after the Americans pushed the Chinese back and retook Alaska, VaultTec began mass producing underground vaults for the US government to preserve people and so on and so forth. Again, it took about 20 years before the Great War happened and it destroyed everything. So that was a good amount of time for VaultTec to actually build quite a few different vaults and then get people into them. Now, the sinister thing about this is VaultTec only built a handful of vaults that were actually meant to house people and keep them safe until the radiation was gone and they could return to the surface. There were over 100, I think there were 122 or somewhere in that neighborhood, vaults built, and the vast majority of them were actually very diabolical social experiments. Many of these social experiments were absolutely horrible. As an example, in Vault 106, they pumped psychoactive drugs into the vault with more than 100 inhabitants to see what the results of isolation with a hallucinogen would cause. And many of them fell into a relaxed state, and they got to observe what would happen. Unfortunately, there were a few of them that fell into a violent frenzy, and they overcame the vault and all their defenses, and it ultimately brought the vault down. Then there was Vault 92, which is particularly nasty. This was to preserve the best musicians, and VaultTec went around throughout the United States and got all of the best musicians to sign up to go to this particular vault, should, the Great War happen. It was actually an experiment to subliminally control them using white noise, which actually didn't work out, and they activated aggressive areas of the brain, and yet again, kind of like Vault 106, aggressive people equals vault that falls. There's no preserved humanity there. One of the last ones I'll bring up is Vault 11, which is one of my favorite vaults, and that it's, again, a very sinister one. There would be an election held every year to sacrifice one of the vault dwellers, or the computers would kill everyone that was there, and that was the experiment that they were performing there. Of course, nobody knew about that except for the overseer before the doors were sealed. Well, because the vault dwellers had no idea that's what was happening, and they were told after the doors were sealed, the very first person to be elected was the overseer. And then that became like the norm after that. Every year, a new overseer would be elected. They would serve for a year, and at the end of the year, they would sacrifice themselves to the computers. Now, this went on for quite a while. So social order arose around this whole election concept over the overseer, until one overseer ordered that the elections would now be held by the computers and not the vault dwellers themselves, because this whole social order had been created around who could vote for what and so on and so forth, and there was one specific group of folks that were manipulating the entire system to their advantage, or at least trying to. And as an attempt to stop, the overseer that was most recently elected changed the way that the elections work. Fear of social collapse caused social collapse in a civil war within this vault that ultimately claimed nearly everyone. I think one person got out in the end. And the most ironic part about it is, the other part of that experiment was, if no one was chosen, if they resisted the computer sacrificing, they would have been praised and freed from the vault. Now, many more gruesome and diabolical experiments were happening in the vaults in the Fallout series, and you come across as a player throughout the various games many different vaults. Some of them were legitimate vaults that were holding people and released them on time, and they created new societies out in post-apocalyptic America. Others were terrible experiments where people still managed to get out, or others were creating terrible creatures that managed to get out. Now, if I was going to refer you to any place to catch up on information about the various different vaults or any of content related to Fallout, I would have to point you to Oxhorn, who is a YouTuber that I greatly respect, and I have watched a tremendous number of his videos. He has a tremendous number of videos, but he explains each of the vaults and what's going on, and in many cases brings up theories that aren't clear in the actual game itself. I'll leave a link down in the description for you to check out some of his stuff. If you're a Fallout fan and you don't know about Oxhorn, he's a YouTuber you need to at least take a look at his channel. Even Bethesda officially recognized Oxhorn and invited him to the White Springs Hotel when they did their media and press preview for Fallout 76. Which I won't get into that. The whole reason that I created the Bryce Jones Survives Fallout 4 comic was in preparation and anticipation of Fallout 76. And then the release of Fallout 76 was rather disappointing. Maybe one day I'll go back to it and try it again. I explored all the content that they had when it first was released, and then just found it repetitious at the end, like most massive multiplayer online games become, and lost interest. But I highly recommend you check out Oxhorn. And obviously at the end here, I was using a total dark to kind of overlay everything and erasing through it to make kind of a glowing effect. I didn't want it to be a bright glow, I wanted it to be like a dull glow, except for of course around the Fallout logo in and of it. So if you like this video, why not give it a like down there? And if you haven't, subscribe and hit the bell for notifications for when I release new videos, which I release videos on Sundays. So thanks for watching. Remember to be kind to each other and use your turn signals.